As polycrisis rains down on the international landscape and winds of turbulence test policymakers, have no fear. GLOBSEC is here to tame the storm. It is my privilege to be reporting from the GLOBSEC Forum, held in Prague and under the auspices of Czech President Petr Pavel. The 19th edition of our flagship conference will be record-breaking. For the next 3 days, I will be delivering you policy highlights and recaps from our top-tier lineup of international speakers and moderators. Follow us on social media and let's get into it. Like tradition, we started the day off with our annual Defense Roundtable, co-hosted by the George C. Marshall European Center for Security, where discussions covered a range of issues like unmanned systems, modern warfare, and European innovation. In concert, another high-level side event on Europe's strategic priorities and tech ambitions took place. The 2024 GLOBSEC Forum was officially opened with welcome remarks from GLOBSEC President and Founder Robert Vasch, where he forcefully expressed his optimism about shaping the future, emphasizing that with 2,000 people gathered in Prague, they have the power to steer the world amidst a growing storm, reminding everyone that history sometimes needs a little push. Shortly thereafter, Czech President Petr Pavel took to the stage for a keynote that elaborated on Europe and the world's current security landscape. To wrap up the opening sessions, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, in her first public address since being elected for a second mandate, announced that she will be appointing a dedicated defense commissioner and declared, Central Europe is not only geographically at the heart of Europe, but it is also politically and strategically central to the future of the European Union. Still on the Havel stage, GLOBSEC launched its much-anticipated Geotech Center under the leadership of General John Allen, with inputs from Czech President Petr Pavel, Slovene President Nataša Pirc-Musar, former Estonian President and GLOBSEC board member Kersti Kaljulaid, as well as Microsoft Vice Chair and President Brad Smith. They deconstructed some of the most pressing issues regarding how Europe can navigate emerging technologies like AI and biotechnology while maintaining its values and protecting citizens' rights. A forward-looking defense chat featuring NATO Deputy Secretary Mirka Joanna outlined the alliance's ability to swiftly adapt to shifting geopolitical, economic, and technological landscapes, and called for more collaboration with the private sector. GLOBSEC Young Leaders Forum 2024 kicked off with a roundtable on the pervasive threat of disinformation and its impact on democracy, featuring the Slovene president. Shifting to the Albright stage, a stimulating one-on-one with Microsoft's Brad Smith took place, who shared his expertise on the growing severity of contemporary cyber attacks and the urgent need for building societal resilience alongside developing effective deterrent strategies. To conclude, a mix of eclectic government and NGO voices on the Schwarzenberg stage shared their views on the evolving possibilities when it comes to transatlantic relations ahead of the 2024 American presidential elections. That's a wrap on all the discussion and debate on day one from the 2024 GLOBSEC Forum in Prague. But don't worry, there's much action ahead. Follow us on social media and see you on day two.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Steve Clemons.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Is everybody out running? Feel good? How many have downloaded the GLOBSEC app? Okay. Bad. No? You got to get the GLOBSEC app. How many of you have been to a side forum? Yeah, we've got a good handful. Are you enjoying them? I hope you are. We're getting a good nod. Well, right now we're going to continue the magnificent momentum we had from yesterday, and I want to tell you about last night first. Some of us got the privilege of being in the magnificent fairy tale castle we had a fantastic tribute evening of the GLOBSEC Award ceremony. We gave leadership awards to European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, also the Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen, who will be on this stage today, and also the very famous and accomplished in memoriam Czech diplomat Martin Povedsil. So it's great. We're going to continue all of that today. And just to give you a flavor of this on the Havel stage, we will also have the President of Finland, Slovenia, as I mentioned, the Prime Minister of Denmark. We're going to have programs on countering Russia's hybrid threats, flashpoints in East Asia, and on Schwarzenberg, next door. We're going to have the future of EU-China relations, priorities for the new European leadership, looking into the EU's enlargement process, which has come up quite a bit in the various sessions. And then on the Albright stage, remember, up the cafe, through the cafe on the other side of the building. Great panel, fantastic. I was up there yesterday quite a bit. Panels on the future of EU defense, and the EU's digital agenda, zooming in on the reality of the ground in Ukraine. And after all of that, if you want to go on a 10K run with me at 3 o'clock, join me at the front, and we can go, go for a nice run. But let me now do something important. We're going to introduce a friend of mine who is the chairman of BPT Partners, the co-founder of BPT Partners, and chairman of the board of the GLOBSEC US Foundation. We have been building GLOBSEC in the United States. I get to co-chair with him the GLOBSEC US initiative. And so what you're seeing here, we're going to build in the United States as well, and I hope you'll be very active with that. So please welcome to the stage my good friend Petr Pudil. Petr?
Dobré ráno, dámy a pánové. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of GLOBSEC, I'm honored to open the second day of the 19th edition of GLOBSEC Forum, which is firstly accommodated in Prague, in my hometown, which I feel even more honored to be here with you. Actually, we had the opportunity to listen inspiring views of many political leaders, experts, and visionaries last day. But I think it's maybe too early to make some summary, but I would just point out one word which I found like a very often and which is like a connecting all topics which was discussed here yesterday. It's technology. Technology is shaping our future. It can bring us a better life, better world, but also it's associated with the risks and fears of the population, which are understandable. And I think that if you look to the agenda of today's program, I think that you can find the topic of technology present in most of the topics, if not in all of them. And I am very much happy that GLOBSEC announced yesterday the new initiative led by the US Foundation, which is a geotech center, which would be focused on that topic in upcoming years under the political leadership of President Pavel. So I wish you a really good day. I hope that you had a good night in Prague, elsewhere. But now it's a time to introduce a very special guest, who is a foreign minister of the Czech Republic, Mr. Jan Lipavský.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear friends. It's my pleasure to have the opportunity to speak at the official opening of the second day of the GLOBSEC Forum 2024. And we are very honored to host in Prague the event that has, over the years, established itself as a top venue for discussions about security, foreign policy, freedom, and democracy. We are living in turbulent times, meeting each other and discussing new ways how to defend our countries and societies, their values, and their well-being is increasingly important. One issue will be crucial for Europe's future. That one issue is how we deal with Russia's aggression against the West. The stage from which I'm addressing you today holds the name of the late Czechoslovak and Czech President Václav Havel, and he once said, I quote, "The Russian problem is that it doesn't exactly know where it begins and where it ends." End of the Václav Havel quote. To put it bluntly, Russian imperial ambitions have no limits unless we set them. Ukraine has been bravely resisting Russian aggression for 2.5 years. Ukrainians also fight on our behalf. We must support their fight for freedom and independence politically and militarily. The ammunition initiative we put forward and the response it got from the other countries proved to me that this remains our shared goal. I rest assured that we finally understood that Putin's ultimate goal is to deconstruct and renegotiate the European security architecture, to make it favorable to Russian interests. It is naive to think that if Russia won in Ukraine, its tanks would stop at its western borders. In this twisted vision, the sovereignty and integrity of nearby countries and their citizens' freedom would need to align with the Kremlin's will. Russian victory would mean a fundamentally insecure and volatile Europe. Whether our reasoning is ethical or pragmatic, we need to bear in mind that there is no real prosperity without security. That needs to be our answer to those who advocate for appeasement towards Russia. Resisting Russian imperialism, it is the call of the day. It is also a key part of a much larger struggle to preserve the world governed by the UN Charter and international law. It is vital that we continue to live together in an environment in which the power of international law, not the law of stronger, prevails. Our security and prosperity depend on it. Those who challenge the UN Charter and the rules-based international order cooperate ever more closely. Our community of democratic countries must do the same and better. Our democratic values give us the basis, but we must start working harder not to lose them. This is why we have initiated practical steps to increase resistance in our societies, such as those against espionage activities under diplomatic cover. Ladies and gentlemen, if we want to succeed, we have homework to do. Recent elections in Europe and elsewhere show that our societies are becoming further polarized. It is as if we are finding it increasingly difficult to reach a consensus on our future and the key issues we face. Central Europe is an area where this political polarization is one of the strongest in Europe. Russia wants to divide us and is supporting populists from all sides, no matter if they are left or right. One of the possible remedies is strategic communication. This notion that the public in my country has only heard about recently. Let me elaborate what to picture. For me, strategic communication is like that one class in school where you felt so inspired that you wanted to keep learning even in your free time. It's the kind of class where the teacher didn't tell you what to think, but how to think. If we can sow the seeds of strategic communication within our society, we will harvest the benefits with future classes. Only a critical thinking, well-informed and resilient society can withstand the pressures of hybrid warfare. The goal of our strategic communication of Stratcom is clear. We need to talk to people before the Kremlin propaganda does. The less we do, the more they believe in lies and our adversaries. The tools of the Russian hybrid warfare may be new, but the goals are the same as those we remember from the Soviet era. After all, as we can see on the military battlefield, progress was never Russia's strongest suit. However, much more determination is needed. That has been the case so far. Anything is better than no response. Our inaction only serves to confirm to an aggressor like Russia that its actions were justified and will be in the future. Let us reinforce and enforce the existing law. Already existing law can be used to limit Russian influence, such as those on incitement to hatred, incitement to violence, spreading alarmist messages, or denying and justifying genocide. Use sanction mechanisms, investigate Russian interference in the elections, demand greater accountability and engagement with digital platforms. There is no magic countermeasure that would solve the whole problem. But in allowing a foreign power to misuse our freedom of speech and media, we are defending democracy. We are showing the flaws in our policy. So if we truly believe in protecting our values, we must have the courage to act. The time for talking is over. It's our duty now to stand firm and prove that our principles are more than just words, that they are our commitment. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention.
Mr. Foreign Minister, let me just tell everyone, we are so grateful at GLOBSEC for everything you've done to be such an incredible host for this conference. And I would say if I had the power, and I'm going to take the power, I dub you GLOBSEC hero for getting us here. So Ambassador, Foreign Minister Jan Lipavsky, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you. And now we have a great privilege. A good friend of mine, Justin Vogt, the executive editor of Foreign Affairs, is going to bring to the stage the next panel on countering Russia's hybrid threats. Justin Vogt.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Steve. Thank you very much. Good morning. Welcome to all. I want to start this morning with a show of hands, sort of like Steve did. I'd like you to raise your hand if you agree with the following statement. Hybrid warfare is a useful term that describes something that really exists. Raise your hand if you believe that that is true. Okay, pretty much the entire room, which puts me in something of a minority here, because I am unconvinced. I am not sure that hybrid warfare is a useful term or that it describes something that really exists. There's a definition, we've all heard it, it's combining military means with non-military means, informational, technological, cultural, economic, in order to produce some desired outcome in a conflict. Now, to me, that definition sounds an awful lot like what I would call foreign policy. And I'm an editor, so I obsess about language like this. I want to make clear that this isn't just a quibble. It's something very important because, as the foreign minister has pointed out, the threat here is very real. The problem is that if we don't understand it properly, or we use language that allows us to misperceive it, it won't be possible to confront, deter, or defeat rivals that use these techniques. So we're lucky today to have this panel, because if there's anyone who can convince me that I'm wrong, it's going to be some combination of these four people. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage. Folks, please come on out and take a seat with me here. We're going to have, first is Jan Lipavsky, who you've just heard, the foreign minister. Here he is. Mr. Foreign Minister, please. Mihai Popșoi is the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Moldova. Mr. Foreign Minister, welcome, thank you. Stephen Doughty. And this one is a mouthful. He is the Minister of State for Europe, North America, and the United Kingdom of the Foreign, Commonwealth, and Development Office of the United Kingdom. Please welcome. And finally, Marie-Doha Besancenot is the Assistant Secretary General for Public Diplomacy for NATO. Welcome, Marie-Doha. Thanks. All right, thank you all. So I'm going to start with you, Mr. Foreign Minister, because we just heard your remarks. They were very interesting to me. We spoke about this quickly backstage, about my skepticism about this concept of hybrid warfare. So here's what I'd like you all to do in your first question for me. It's a real softball, which is, tell me why I'm wrong, or why I'm wrong to doubt that this is a real thing, that this hybrid warfare really exists, that it's not just a piece of jargon that's bubbled up in discourse. Why is it real? And more importantly, why does understanding it this way help you as a policymaker or even just as an analyst to craft strategies to counter it?
So there is quite a lot of proof that hybrid warfare exists. But I think in the case how you asked me, it would be start with our interests in it, and that's the security. The security of our people, the security of our societies, once the Russian propaganda was mildly spreading across social networks, it could be something for argue, because, okay, those are just some comments and we don't have to care about that. But this is not just about that. It's a well-orchestrated effort by Russian Federation, by Russian state, to sow disunity into our societies. And in the last 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, we can see more and more kinetic action taking place with consequences. And the answer is to be resilient and to limit the Russian ability to do so, and to understand that they do it on purpose. That this is something where they dedicate quite a lot of resources. It's a part of the Russian strategy toward West, toward their neighbors. And, you know, if you study the speeches of the different figures in the Russian Federation, they are speaking about it like we are speaking here. You know, we need to use this tool, you know, destroy.
Yes, they're very open about it.
So they are very open about that, because it's instruction for their people to do so, and they are not hiding it, even hiding it. So it's a reality. You can see it in the UK. We can hear from the minister soon what happened recently. In Czechia, I think the worst example was the ammunition, the blow-up of the ammunition stores in Vrbětice. It happened 2014. So it's not even recently, we just discovered 3 years ago. And it was recently, a few months ago, when the arson attack was committed in Prague against the public infrastructure, with the aim to sow disunity into society, to sow fear. You can connect it also to all the time nuclear rhetoric from the Russian side and many other actions. So really, there is one remedy: to be resilient, to do everything to show them that this won't be tolerated, and cut off ties to those crawling attempts.
Mr. Foreign Minister, or Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, does that gel with your understanding of what the Russians are doing in Moldova? And how would you say it differs in any way? Or is it the same sort of tactics, the same campaign? And do you agree that part of what the Foreign Minister had pointed out in his speech was that part of this problem is an education problem? I thought that was actually quite interesting. I'm wondering whether you see it the same way.
Well, indeed, for some, hybrid threats, hybrid warfare may sound as a fuzzy concept. In Moldova, it's not fuzzy at all. It's very concrete. Be it the Russians using the energy leverage to increase energy bills 500% overnight. Be it propaganda, convincing some from our citizenry to deny or ignore the war in Ukraine while having Ukrainian refugees living next door, or using Moldovan citizens from the diaspora to spray provocative graffiti in Paris and throughout France to discredit Moldova and Moldovans ahead of the all-important decisions to start EU accession negotiations, or funnel through all kinds of avenues cash into the country to sponsor protests, to topple a legitimate, and I must say, although call me biased, a popular government in Moldova, supported by a majority of citizens, using all sorts of crypto technology, good old money mules, folks coming into the country with pockets full of cash while having left the country 3 days ago without any money. So all these avenues are as concrete as they can be. And of course, they don't shy away even from using some kinetic engagements here and there. Some explosions in the Transnistrian region pop up from time to time, just to add to this scare, to this environment of uncertainty. Because the biggest narrative that the Russians are pushing in Moldova is scaring Moldovans with war and trying to equate Moldova's government pro-European, pro-reform stance as inviting war. Of course, they're not particularly happy with our new national security strategy, where we have identified Russia as the main national security threat to Moldova, along with corruption, by the way. And the Russians have actually weaponized and instrumentalized corruption for political ends. And we can see that lively nowadays with the lineup of pro-Russian candidates in our election. Needless to say, not all of them are quite presidential material, that's diplomatically speaking, but that doesn't stop them from running when they have the backing of the Kremlin. And they hope that with all this leverage, with all this hybrid toolbox, that they have a chance. But we will be working hard, and we count on our citizens to be able to discern between those that are in line with Moldova's national interest and those that are playing to the tune and doing the Russian bidding in Moldova.
Stephen, sometimes when you're in Eastern and Central Europe, you hear a little bit of irritation, actually, about the British in this regard, in that the UK is sometimes seen as a place where some of the funding and logistics and the ability to carry out the stuff like this have well, I don't want to say they've been based there, but there are people there who are involved in these efforts, and historically, the British have dealt perhaps as much as their Eastern neighbors with Russian influence operations. I'm wondering, what is it that the British government, how does the British government see this? Is it something that they see as a direct threat to the UK, or is it more about sort of supporting those who are more in the crosshairs of the Kremlin?
Yes, it is a direct threat to the UK, and we've heard of clear examples already from ministerial colleagues on the panel, but we've been experiencing this for a very long time, and we have to look at it in the full spectrum. It is a useful concept. Sabotage, disinformation, cyber attacks, attempts to use chemical and radiological weapons on our territories. There's a whole spectrum of activities here. Pressure on energy systems, and we've seen this for a very long time. This is not new. We're seeing it in new capabilities, and we're seeing it in new coordination. Of course, it's not just Russia doing this. There are other hostile states, indeed non-state actors, using these tactics as well. These groups are learning from each other. They're learning tactics, they're learning techniques, particularly in the information space. They're adapting to the use of AI, quantum, all of these things to turbocharge those efforts. So I think it is a useful concept, and I think it's a useful concept because that also then influences how we respond. And in the UK government, we do take a holistic response to this. I work closely with ministers across government departments on these issues, whether it's our electoral commission, whether it's our domestic security minister, whether it's our education department, whether it's our universities department, because hostile states and indeed hostile non-state actors are targeting all parts of our societies, our economies, our intellectual space, our industries. And unless we understand that scope and scale and get real about that, we're not going to be able to deliver the holistic, full-spectrum response to it.
It sounds to me like you're saying to combat hybrid warfare, you need to do something that resembles hybrid warfare. How would you say that? What's the difference between doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are common. Firstly, an analysis and understanding of what's actually going on. Secondly, deterrence. Thirdly, defensive capabilities. There are a whole series of responses that we need to have in the domestic and the international space, and of course, the blurring between those two things is increasing. I think we also have a responsibility in working with NATO partners and others to be sharing expertise, understanding, capability. We work very closely with our friends in Czechia on these issues. We're all, standing in support of Moldova in their challenge that they face very contemporaneously at the moment. And it's one of the reasons why, as well, in what we're saying about a reset of the UK's relationships with Europe as a whole, but also specifically with the EU, that these matters need to be at the front and centre of any UK-EU security pact that we develop going forward, because we all share this common threat. And as I said, it's predominantly focused on Russia in our own continent, but also other hostile states and other actors that are attempting to undermine our societies.
Marie-Doha, you've heard everyone on the panel talk about how this is this capacious thing that involves all these different elements of statecraft. How do you, as a policymaker, zero in on details and specifics? Because in order to react to any of this stuff, you need to kind of think through it carefully and figure out what's what and what's not part of this. How do you, go about doing that, and how should we all understand how to break down the various components and respond to them?
You're right. I think the term hybrid has been useful and is still useful in order to highlight the coordinated dimension of this. And just last June, actually, the North Atlantic Council, so the nations themselves, decided to issue a statement calling out a heavy increase in hybrid actions in their own territory. Why did they do that? 7 nations, actually, very different geographies from Estonia to the UK. They did this also to emphasize the fact that this is NATO business. This is targeting simultaneously different allies, different geographies, different techniques, different modes of hybrid, but at the same time to achieve the same goals. So I think there is some usefulness still in the term hybrid, and also to underline that all this is happening under the threshold of war, as we mentioned, but is very impactful in its coordination. Now, I agree with you. It is helpful to be more specific, and indeed, each one of those nations knows very well what kind of hybrid tactic has just hit them. And this ranges from weaponization of migrations on the Finnish border to targeting undersea, critical undersea infrastructure, to indeed what I would call stunts inside of our capitals with graffitis aimed at dividing and creating chaos inside our democracies. So yes, these are very much combined. How do we tackle this? I would say, in terms of policy, what NATO, what allies have decided in the past years is at every single summit actually defined the coordination that comes with the risk assessment. And so hybrid threats has been very well identified for a couple of years, and this year I'm very proud to say that for the first time there is a standalone paragraph. The allies have decided that to distinguish the paragraph dedicated to hybrid threats, and there's a separate one dedicated entirely to disinformation, and already defining a few lines of responses along coordination, alert mechanisms, and the different things we've been trying to set up.
You just mentioned, and Jan also in your remarks, you talked about the sort of sowing of discord in democracies as a major element of this. Isn't the discord already there? And is part of dealing with hybrid warfare, to the extent that it is real, a matter of addressing the vulnerabilities that exist in democratic societies just naturally? What do you know, is it possible actually to combat efforts at propaganda or to mislead people without actually focusing on the problems themselves? So I guess what I would ask you, Jan, is when you look at Czech society, what do you see as the vulnerabilities that need to be addressed, and how do you do that in a way that's actually sort of honest and transparent? Because that's part of what you're talking about, is a sort of truthfulness that is lacking in Russia's communications. What do you tell your colleagues about how do we address these things?
So basically, I covered it in my remarks. The topic of the day is strategic communication in Czechia. So the state, the bureaucracy, the institutions are learning how to do so. We put a lot of political effort into that. So, for example, we have a great cooperation with PDD and NATO, with our partners and allies. This is the topic of the day, and I'm very optimistic about that, actually, because it's going on in a good way.
Let me ask you something. So to me, maybe this is an American thing, but when I hear strategic communication, that actually sounds like something that, for example, corporations do when they have a crisis. That it doesn't necessarily emphasize truthfulness and transparency. So what do you mean by what's strategic about just being honest?
First of all, we have more than crisis currently.
Okay.
We are facing existential threat from the Russian imperialism.
Okay.
Secondly, so we need to act. Secondly, the concept is more broader than that. If you do not put out your story, if you do not protect democracy, we know that there are flaws in the way how our society works. So we have to plug this hole. We have to provide broad public with a set of information. If we do not so, the malign actor will. So that's this concept. Put it very simply.
Is Moldova doing something similar? Is there a focus on strategic communication, teaching officials, even educators, people in civil society, how to talk about the problems that Moldova actually faces that are not the result of Russian, badness?
Yes, we try. We have just created recently a strategic communication center modeled after the experience of our friends from the Baltics, adjusting it to Moldovan realities. But you're totally right. You hit the nail on the head when it comes to the Kremlin exploiting pre-existing divisions and vulnerabilities. And God knows Moldova has many of those. We have a divided society. We have a country that has been struggling economically. The cynicism is that many of these challenges do have a direct link with our regional experience with Russia as a neighbor or hegemon for a long time. You know, we have a Moldovan community in Kazakhstan, which is a result of Stalin concentrated deportation efforts of the most entrepreneurially active-minded Moldovans during the Soviet times. Now, for 30 years, we have the unresolved separatist region of Transnistria in the Republic of Moldova, which the Russians have exploited, have created and exploited to hold Moldova back and to keep hostage both the residents of the Transnistrian region and the rest of the Republic of Moldova, to not allow us to develop properly. So creating and perpetuating these vulnerabilities while also exploiting them for political ends. The same goes with energy. We've had politicians in Moldova who were either pro-Russian or even some who pretended to be pro-European, but were maintaining and cementing Moldova's dependence on Gazprom. Because they not only didn't have a disincentive to do that, they actually had a clear incentive to maintain this dependency because they were benefiting from the corrupt contracts that were involved. Thankfully, that is a thing of the past. Moldova has turned that page, and now we are trying to truly build a more resilient society with the support of our friends and partners in the European Union and the broader Euro-Atlantic community. And we are working with our entire society, and it's not easy. Because when you have allowed your citizenry to live under the spell of Russian propaganda for 30 years, the damage is so severe that it will take years, if not generations, to actually create a proper functioning democratic space and a proper functioning media space. And when it comes to a democratic space, we have a competitive political environment, something that unfortunately the Russian citizens cannot enjoy in their homeland, but what the Kremlin is exploiting in the Republic of Moldova and elsewhere. They're exploiting the democratic process and democracy itself against democracy. They are using our freedoms in trying to undermine the very system that we have. But the system, as Winston Churchill said, is the worst system except for all the others. And you cannot fight these Russian tactics with the same means, because otherwise you become like them. You can only fight it with more democracy, with more freedom, because that's part and parcel of Russian agenda in our region, including in Ukraine. They've put out a whole host of reasons for their aggression, but in my eyes, the ultimate reason was to deny the development of Ukraine as a sovereign and democratic country, because then Russian citizens would have started asking questions. How come you can have competitive elections in Ukraine and Moldova? How come you can have freedom of the press? How come you can have an independent media that questions the spending of public resources? How come you can have an active civil society questioning the enormous corruption and graft in the government? So that was the main reason of the war, and we are encouraged by the support of the international community and the enormous determination and sacrifice of the Ukrainian armed men and women who are keeping Moldova safe, and quite frankly, who are keeping all of us safe and defending all of our values. And I must say they're quite successful, especially nowadays with the developments in Kursk, which the Kremlin is calling a situation. That's an example of strategic communication right there.
That's very well put, and it tees up the question I had, and I'll put this to Stephen and also to Marie-Doha, which is a lot of what you have been talking about. It sounds mostly like defense, and I'm curious about whether there's an offense element to this. You know, a lot of this is about, well, the Russians are kind of trying to exploit weaknesses in our system. As you've pointed out, the Russian system has quite a few weaknesses as well. Is part of responding to hybrid warfare a way of not... You pointed out, Mihai, that you don't want to become like the Russians, right? That's part of the strategy, is to kind of degrade and to kind of be able to do this whataboutis thing, to say, well, you do the same things, right? But I'm just wondering, if you're just fighting defense all the time, it's unlikely that you're going to win. Stephen, is there any offensive element to fighting hybrid warfare on the other guy's side?
I just wanted to make a point, just following on from the previous discussion first, about the difference between some of the, particularly in the information space, the difference between very specific disinformation related to incidents or events or countries or individuals, and the more generalized approach which is being taken to undermine the very foundations of our democracies. I think one of the classic tactics that the Russians, and indeed others, use is to just sap the ability and confidence of a population to think that they can know anything. If we look back to the Skripal incident in the UK, the multiple different narratives and stories that were presented at the time create a fog, which for many people means that they just have this uneasiness, this uncertainty.
You can't trust anything.
You can't trust anything. You can't trust anything. And this is exactly what they want our populations to think, because it creates the breeding ground for others and other forces and authoritarians and autocrats to come into that space. So I think it's important that we make that distinction.
Sure.
There are sometimes very, very specific events, and then there's that more generalized sense. I think in relation to your second question, colleagues already reflected on this, we cannot become like them. They are reckless, they are irresponsible, they do not follow international law, they have no concept of ethics. We do have all of those things, and it's what makes us strong. So what we do must be lawful, it must be responsible, it must be proportionate, it must be in the way that we conduct our conventional warfare, within the rules, within the responsibilities, within the international agreements that we have. And I think that is a crucially important distinction that we have as societies, as militaries, as democracies. And I think what concerns me at the moment is an increasing willingness to engage in hugely reckless behavior across all of the different domains, particularly by Russia, but also by other actors. The last thing I would say is, as a practicing politician, as somebody who represents a community, a very diverse community in South Wales, and I've been a member of Parliament for 12 years before being appointed a minister now, but I still have my community responsibilities. I have seen the real life effects of hybrid warfare in my own communities, and not just by Russia, but also by other groups. I have had extreme right-wing groups attempt to undermine, to groom, to activate individuals in my own community. I've had extremist Islamist groups attempt to do the same and to groom and indoctrinate young individuals to get them to go and fight for ISIS, for Al-Shabaab. And I have seen those Russian narratives around the Skripal incident, or indeed about Ukraine, playing out in the very communications I receive from my constituents and discussions locally. So these have real-world effects on politicians. And actually, there's a responsibility for resilience for those in elected office, for those in positions of responsibility, also to be very careful about what we share, about our own responsibility, not to accidentally, or indeed in some cases deliberately, amplify false narratives or incidents. And it's very important that in our own democratic institutions that we are training and equipping our legislators, our journalists and others to verify, to understand what is going on, so that we don't become unwitting pawns in the agendas of whether it's Russia or indeed other hostile actors.
Obviously, you said that Moscow is reckless about this. Marie-Doha, I want to ask you this question of you, and I doubt that NATO would sort of publicly commit to something like this, but I just wonder whether wouldn't the kind of use of truthful, accurate information, but delivered in a way into Russia that's a little creative, or a little bit outside the normal kind of just conventional, well, we have news media and we try to get it in there. I guess I think that when a couple of people have referred back to the Cold War and the Soviet era, I mean, one of the things that worked during the Cold War was, I think, what you would call hybrid warfare on the part of the West. That just seems to be totally absent now. And I just wonder whether, or maybe it's completely covert, but could you talk a little bit about what is it that NATO or NATO member states can do to kind of push back, but by using some of the same means, albeit with accurate, truthful and honest information as opposed to kind of misleading and stuff that's supposed to sow discourse. Because clearly undercutting the regime in Moscow would be in some sense the benefit of all of the countries represented up here.
Well, maybe I would first differentiate what the military does and what the civilian side of the house does. I'm on the civilian side of the house, although we do coordinate extremely closely with our military colleagues. Everything the military does, of course, corresponds to a state of situation as analyzed by our Supreme Allied Commanders, so SACEUR, and this is divided into peace, crisis, war. And to these three different states correspond different lines of action and different authorities to do or not do things. Now, I think
just to clarify, you're saying NATO is not at war with Russia.
Exactly.
That's the point.
This
right,
is what I meant.
Sure.
Sorry. Now, but the impatience that you describe at let's stop admiring the problem and being indignant about it, and when do we, start fighting back?
Right.
This is something that we feel very strongly also on the political side, simply because the NAC is comprised of ambassadors who do feel strongly about these things and how they impact their national security. So Stratcom indeed is not new at NATO. What is very difficult today is simply reaching into this Russian sphere, simply because social media and all the media are so controlled. But indeed, so in my division, we do have social media accounts in Russian, and we do craft content in Russian. Of course, there is a deterrence goal, but there is also an assurance goal. I'll give you the four of them: deterrence, assurance, unity, cohesion of NATO, and the last one is trust. So indeed, everything we communicate serves one of these goals according to what is happening in real life. But indeed, so communicating with allies, we know how to do this. How do we communicate with Russian speakers and those who are really trapped in a space that is very controlled? What we do is work indirectly with Russian, call them what you will, and journalists, influencers, content creators who have fled and are still in contact with their own communities back home, and who still, for now, have a couple of channels to actually tell the story from the outside. So yes, with these, we can simply provide truthful information, explanations, what is happening, and support their work. So it is an indirect way of still keeping that access to a population and telling a story.
It's an extremely important point. And the question about Russians in exile, it could be, we could have a whole panel on that, and how exactly to deal with them. That's good. I want to turn this over to the audience, and I want everyone to encourage everyone, if you want, you can use the Slido app. Or you can raise your hand, and I'll call on you. I want to actually start, Marie-Doha, I want to start with you because there's an interesting question on the Slido that I'd like to put to you. It's actually two people, both Charles Tannock and Richard Bambals, have asked a sort of version of the same question. I'll put it in the way that Charles has put it. Hybrid warfare means non-committed hostile acts of aggression. The most obvious are cyber attacks. My question is, should Article 5 of NATO treaty cover these if they are destructive?
Well, in the way it is phrased in the strategic concept, it was phrased 2 years ago, and the way it's been reaffirmed in the two latest declarations in Vilnius and in Washington, it is the case. Indeed, so paragraph 13 this year of the declaration, out of 34, so quite high-ranking if you consider the importance of the paragraphs. And indeed, what the Allies have agreed to is that large actions, hybrid actions, could reach the level of an armed conflict which would justify triggering Article 5. This is the wording that we've had for 2 years now. So indeed, this tells you the level of awareness.
Oh, good. So, Charles, you got a clear answer. The answer is yes. Okay. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand. I'll call on folks who have a question. Please do make it a question, though. Yes, we have the lady here with her hand up. If she can find a microphone, please. And please also identify yourself back here before you ask your question.
So hello, my name is Emma Szczesna, Synopsis. Thank you very much for this debate. I think it's very topical. And actually, I would like to take one of your questions that I don't really think was really answered. And it's like, we are discussing the defense, we're discussing resilience, strategic communications, and how we should strengthen the democracies to be able to face the hybrid threats and respond to it better. We don't really discuss the active part and really what should be done, because if you can look at the map, I think European Union and Europe is really losing the global competition to other actors. We see China standing up, BRICS and increasing and basically creating alternative multilateral organizations where we are not really included. And when we speak about hybrid, it's not only disinformation, right? It's all other fields like economic, infrastructure, not only diplomatic. What should we do as Europe and European Union, maybe NATO, to matter here? And I'm not now meaning the United States, to still matter on the map and to actually be the deterrent, not only because of the Article 5, but because actually we are not those who should be meddled around. And also on the proactive side, not only towards Russia, but other global actors which are rising. Thank you very much.
Okay. I'm gonna try to put that question. Go ahead. You take it. Yeah.
So if I may, as the only EU member at the panel, I think what Ursula von der Leyen has in her vision for the new Commission is to have a geopolitical Europe, to be more geopolitical, and there lies a lot of opportunities. Being it finally sealing the trade treaties being negotiated for decades, Mercosur not being in place means that China is trading in South America, and same is valid for Indo-Pacific nations, as well as ramping up military production in a more clear tasking and streamlining of the cooperation of the scattered military industry in Europe. So I absolutely agree that we need to work hard to be on map. The position of Europe, it's not given, and definitely currently is being challenged.
Maybe if I can add just one word to this.
Please. Yes.
I think the word we're looking at is maybe disruption. Now, how do we disrupt this whole ecosystem? Because we know it increasingly well, and that's probably the new thing in the past year. We've been monitoring, analyzing it so well, and one of the trends we're seeing is that Russian services are really working with digital, marketing firms, and this is what the investigations show. So how do we disrupt this business? And so part of the answer indeed...
These are digital marketing firms that are Russian firms.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so indeed, there's been the Digital Services Act from the EU, and indeed the platforms are now being more transparent and forced to publish reports which are interesting, but still not with sufficient resources to actually take down the content spontaneously before people like us and individual citizens actually refer and flag the inauthentic and coordinated use of their content to them. But I think that the next steps that a lot of us are working on is indeed disrupting this whole business.
This is almost a content moderation problem, is what you're describing. Yeah, Mihai, sure, and Stephen, too.
As an EU candidate country.
Very good.
And as a citizen of a EU member state as well, I must add that European Union, unlike the Russian Federation, has mastered the art of positive incentives. And the best positive incentive, the best mechanism of democratic consolidation in its region that the European Union has is enlargement and the accession process. And you would be surprised when countries like Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia, and others, when they supposedly had the alternative before the war, because now I don't think any reasonable person sees the Russian world as an alternative. But when you had the alternative, on the one hand, you have to have very difficult reforms to join the European Union. And on the other hand, you had to do no reforms to be in the Russian world. All these countries, their societies, have chose the former, to do these difficult reforms, to be part of the European family of nations. And that, at the core of it, is the positive versus negative incentives. The European Union does positive incentives, market access, financial support, technical assistance, and the negative incentives from the Russian side, if you don't bow down to our will, you are in trouble. You don't get gas, your wine overnight is no longer good, although it's great. your independence and sovereignty is thrown into question. Your government is being delegitimized, your societies are torn apart, and these are the tools from the negative incentive toolbox from the Kremlin. And no wonder that whole societies choose to do the heavy lifting, and the no guaranteed outcome of the EU enlargement, as opposed to supposedly the much easier and more enticing option. But it's not, and we know it for a fact because we've lived through it for quite some time. So the European Union is quite a powerful force and should not be underestimated. And we, in the part of the world where we are quite encouraged by the discussions that are happening today in Brussels. And actually yesterday, quite forcefully, Ursula von der Leyen mentioned the plans of consolidating the defense side of the European Union, and that's an important development that is encouraging.
Good. Jan wanted a finger in, and then I'll go to Stephen just quickly. Jan.
I wanted to just put one example where Europe is showing its ability to show geopolitical force, and that's sanctions. In last few years, Europe really ramp up the European Union, the sanction effort, being it sanctioning not only Russian military industry, but also propaganda machines, a lot of propagandists and the Russian medias. So we are doing quite a good job. We can do more.
Are they working? Yeah, that's my question.
Yes, they are working. Of course, we are dealing with different kind of circumventions, and it's not easy issue, but Europe is doing, and Europe has this kind of force. And if we are able to agree, of course, it's an agreement of 27 states. It's not always easy, but we are able to do.
Good. Stephen, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, as a non-EU member, nevertheless,
former
member, that doesn't mean that we cannot cooperate and work very, very closely on these issues together. And that's why we had this at the centrality of the European political community, which we hosted in Blenheim just weeks into our new government, and to make very, very clear there, to do that strategic communication piece, to make very, very clear that we might have had a new government in the UK, but we stand resolutely with Ukraine to victory, that we stand resolutely to our NATO commitments, that we stand resolutely behind Article 5, that we stand resolutely behind our independent nuclear deterrent, that we stand resolutely behind increasing our defence spending to 2.5%, and that we stand resolutely with our European allies, whether they're in the EU, outside of the EU, inside NATO, outside of NATO, because the threat is real, it's existential, it's multifaceted, it's increasingly dangerous, it's increasingly reckless, and we have to work together. If we don't have a shared concept of the threat picture, a shared concept of what we need to do to challenge that, and a shared belief that we've got to do that together united, then we will fail. And we have responsibilities. I think we are very like-minded on this panel, in and out of the EU, in and out of NATO. Many of the people in this room will share our views on these matters, but there are others who don't, and there are other forces and other political forces and other dynamics in countries across Europe that we need to challenge. And by showing that unity and that resolve and communicating that clearly, we can then more adequately respond to the threat that's there.
I want to take a question from Slido. This is a good question from Nicholas Dunay. He says, what do the panelists think of the arrest of Pavel Durov? And does that indicate that the West may be ready to step up the offense side of things? Although I'm not sure exactly that's offense, it's a sort of defense. But it gets to this question of content moderation, right? Telegram obviously is a sort of Wild West when it comes to information. I'm wondering if any of the panelists have a response to that.
I mean, I'm not going to comment on law enforcement operations of another country, but what I would say is I actually have a deeper concern sometimes about what is going on in the channels and the communities that we cannot see. We spend a lot of time concerned, and rightly so, about what is on different social media platforms that we can all see in public. But actually, and you can look at recent events in the UK on this effect, the way that violence, disorder activities are organised is increasingly in places that we cannot see publicly, and whether that's in closed messaging channels or indeed in the dark web or in other communities. And we've seen, again, all of the hostile actors that we face, whether those are hostile states or indeed non-state actors, using the full range of resources to hide, to organise, to to conduct their activities. And I think also increasingly where there would have been a chain, and there often is in certain operations, a clear chain of command, unfortunately learning from some of the other extremist groups we've seen around the world, where actually inspiring, grooming, and then setting free to act organically. And I think this is a huge challenge that we need to be aware of, and that ability of individuals to act inspired and organised and with often deadly effect, but without actually a direct intent or instruction or command. And I think that's a challenge that we all have to work on together.
Yeah, we've got a question in the audience. The gentleman in the back with the blue shirt with his hand up there.
Yes, good morning. My name is Igor Berlian, Ukrainian journalist at Detector Media. Thank you very much for a very insightful discussion. I have a question about the recent UK riots, and actually I've been monitoring different Telegram channels about it in Russian. And even there were comparisons of attacks on migrants with the events in Odessa in May 2014, like alienating societies. And what is your perspective, Stephen, about eliminating Russian information threat and Russian influence in the UK?
In terms of the recent events, they are very recent, and ascribing particular causes or responsibilities in that is not for this panel today. But obviously, we can see that there was very clear disinformation provided around a terrible, tragic event that happened in a city in the UK. For those who aren't aware, terrible murder of young children, and completely false information shared about this, which clearly then inspired extreme right and far right.
Is there any evidence, actually, though, that there was a foreign or element to that disinformation?
I mean, I'm not going to get into a conversation about that here today. Okay. But certainly, we've seen repeatedly, whether it's a tragedy, whether it's a particular incident, whether it's another weakness or vulnerability that exists already in our societies, the willingness of hostile states and other actors to use that to amplify, to cause further dissent and division. We've seen that as a repeated tactic. But the bottom line is, when it comes to the recent events in the UK, those responsible were thugs, they were criminals. Many of them are now facing very, very serious prosecution and lengthy jail terms. And the Prime Minister acted robustly, swiftly. And actually, it shows also how, when we can use strategic communications in our own societies quickly and responsibly to have effect, once people saw that people were going to be punished rapidly for acts of criminality and thuggery on the streets of the UK, wherever that might be, whatever was inspiring or motivating them, they were going to be dealt with swiftly by the law enforcement authorities. And people saw that rapidly, and we've thankfully seen an end to that violence and disorder. But we've all seen in our societies weak points repeatedly exposed and further used to sow division in our societies. But as I said, there are multiple responsible actors for those. And of course, the individuals who are sharing false information, whipping things up online. If it's a crime offline, it's a crime online too. And many of the individuals are now facing criminal prosecutions as a result of things that they've done. Obviously, in individual cases, that's a matter for our law authorities.
All right. Well, with that, I'm afraid we're going to have to close our conversation. I hope you all join me in thanking our panelists. This is exactly the kind of conversation, frankly, that looks at difficult issues, that tries to grapple with it. This, I believe, Jan, is exactly the sort of thing that you're talking about in terms of how we can best prepare ourselves to deal with this onslaught of misinformation and propaganda. So thank you all for illuminating it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you all. The next session is with the Danish Prime Minister. It starts in just a few moments. Thank you all.